The 19th of December 1944, the 82nd Airborne arrived in the Belgian village of Verbermont, and immediately General Gavin sent his regiments east to determine the enemy's positions and strength. The 504th was sent north to link in with the 30th Infantry Division. The 505th was sent directly east towards the village of Bastogne, while the 508th was sent to the south of Trois Ponts to the village of Grand Halleux. The 2nd Battalion of the 505th was sent forward to Trois Ponts. Behind me there is the small Belgian town of Trois Ponts, and Trois Ponts, as the name suggests, means three bridges. And Trois Ponts sits at the confluence of the Ambleve River and the Salm River. And it was here between the 18th and 21st of December 1944 that engineers and paratroopers of the US Army would help to blunt Kampfgruppe Peiper's push west. Now, as you can probably see from the terrain around me, Trois Ponts sits right in the base of two valleys, the Salm River Valley and the Ambleve River Valley. And the Ambleve carries on and the Salm River Valley stretches back that way behind me. Now, the terrain is extremely steep, and Trois Ponts is surrounded basically on three sides by small mountains or very big hills, depending on how you want to classify them. And from a defender's point of view, this terrain was about as good as it could get. And this is the hub of Trois Ponts itself. Now, during December, this was the home of headquarters and headquarters service company of the 1111th Engineer Combat Group. And it also had its other units of the 291st, the 51st and the 296th spread in and around this area, carrying out various engineer duties, most of which revolved around working in wood mills and doing construction work. Now, word of the offensive reached the guys here at about 01:30 on the morning of the 17th of December 1944. And as part of the 1111th Engineer Combat Group's response to the offensive, C Company from the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion was sent here to Trois Ponts to start prepping the bridges for demolition. By 0800 on the morning of the 18th of December, 120 men of C Company of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion had assembled in Trois Ponts, along with 12 to 15 men from other units and a squad under the command of Staff Sergeant Paul Hinkle of A Company of the 291st, who had been assigned as a security detachment for the 1111th Engineer Combat Group in Trois Ponts. The engineers had 8 bazookas, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 4 30 caliber machine guns amongst them. Further reinforcements from Company B of the 526 Armoured Infantry Battalion arrived when, during a night move, a squad from B Company in a half-track towing a 57mm anti-tank gun shed a track. Captain Dewitt of the S4 section of the 1111th Engineer Combat Group took the men and added their number to the defence of the village. At 0850 on the morning of the 18th of December, Captain Dewitt placed the 57mm anti-tank gun beyond the viaduct back towards Stavelot along the right side of the N23 road with a good line of fire for approximately 250 metres. In order to install an early warning system, Captain Dewitt ordered Staff Sergeant Smith to send 2 men, Private Fraser and Private Beaker, forward with mines to a point where the N23 disappeared around the bend. The idea was for them to drag the mines across the road and make it back to the gun position. A jeep with 3 men from the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion was positioned about 50 metres behind the mines. Shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning on the 18th of December 1944, the first enemy tanks from Kampfgruppe Peiper hoved into view along the N23, and the daisy chain of mines was pulled across the road and Beaker and Fraser raced back towards the gun. The half-track that was meant to meet them and take them back to the positions in the village wasn't there, having pulled back further, so they were forced to jump into the freezing Ambleve River to keep from being seen by the advancing Germans. They stayed there until darkness and spent the night in the open until they could seek shelter in a farmhouse the following day before being picked up by a jeep from the 30th Infantry Division, the following day being returned to American lines. 3 tanks now rolled into sight and opened up with their machine guns. The jeep outpost sped back toward their own lines and the gun position. The crew of the jeep was ordered back to report to Headquarters Company in Trois Ponts of the impending threat. As the tanks rounded the bend, they opened up on the AT gun with machine gun fire. The anti-tank gunners replied and scored a direct hit on the first tank, and smoke was seen to rise from it. At the same time as the 57mm anti-tank gun was engaging the lead Panthers of Kampfgruppe Peiper, a deafening explosion was heard from the village. The bridge over the Ambleve River had been blown as a result of the report from the jeep crew. Captain Dewitt and the men with the 57mm anti-tank gun were now trapped, and Captain Dewitt could see 8 tanks and infantry advancing towards them along the south side of the road. A direct hit on the anti-tank gun killed the crew, and with the gun being knocked out, the remaining men retreated back through the viaduct, heading north towards Caux, then crossing back over the Ambleve, then doubling back to Trois Ponts. As a result of the anti-tank gun crew and the engineers on the outskirts of Trois Ponts, Peiper now had no quick way across the Ambleve River and out of the valley it snaked through. He was now forced to direct his Kampfgruppe north to Chenaux to cross the Ambleve there. And now the bridge I'm walking on, this is the bridge over the Salm River. This was the bridge that was blown by the men of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, and it was blown by those men in order to prevent the Germans from crossing the Salm River and heading down that road towards Verbermont and the Meuse bridges. As night fell on the 18th of December, the men of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion could hear more German vehicles moving towards La Glaise. These would be from Schnellgruppe Knittel trying to catch up with Kampfgruppe Peiper. In an effort throughout the night to fool the Germans into thinking the forces at Trois Ponts were bigger than they were, Major Yates had the idea to attach heavy chains to the back of a truck and have it drive up and down all night to simulate armour. Lights on vehicles were also switched on and off to simulate reinforcements arrive, and sporadic rifle and machine gun fire from a variety of locations throughout the night, and firing bazookas into the woods to simulate artillery fire. The following day, elements of Schnellgruppe Knittel arrived back at Trois Ponts in the direction towards Stavelot. They would take up positions at the Petit Spy Bridge and the Chateau de Petit Spy, with it being used as a command post. At 2000 hours on the evening of the 19th of December 1944, patrols from the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division made contact with the men of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion. Paratroopers wanted an officer to accompany them back to their headquarters at Haut-Bordeaux. Major Yates ordered Lieutenant John J. Norton to go back with the men of the 505th to brief the airborne on the situation in the village. Now, because of the desperate situation on the front, the 2nd Battalion 505th was placed under the direct control of the 82nd Airborne Divisional Headquarters. General Ira Swift ordered Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort to take the 2nd Battalion of the 505th east to set up defensive positions at Trois Ponts, noting it was a key point given the high bluffs and the bridges across the Salm and Ambleve rivers. They had to be held or blown up at all cost. Swift also ordered Vandervoort to send a single company up onto the bluffs and keep the remaining 2 in reserve on the west bank of the Ambleve. Accompanying the men of the 505th would be a single 57mm anti-tank gun from the 80th AAA Battalion and Company B from the 307th Airborne Engineers. The engineers at Trois Ponts were grateful to see the paratroopers taking up positions around the town. Easy Company would be assigned positions above the bluffs with Dog Company and a platoon from B Company of the Engineers. So situated up here on the northern hill overlooking Trois Ponts was the 81mm mortar platoon that had come forward with the 2nd Battalion of the 505th. And from here they had a really commanding view. They could see the 2 bridges over the Ambleve River, which stretched that way to the north. They could also see the bridges in the Salm Valley as well, further that way. But most importantly, they could see up onto the bluffs in that direction, and they were actually at roughly the same level. So they had a really good commanding view. Now, one thing you have to bear in mind as we walk the ground here, there's a lot of modern houses and new vegetation growth that blocks the way, but all of the accounts state that First Lieutenant Cooper, he was the forward observer that went up with E Company onto the bluffs, that when communicating back with his team, they had an outstanding field of fire from these positions here. So having made it up the bluffs above Trois Ponts, First Lieutenant William J. Meadow, the E Company commander, would sight his men in that patch of woods behind me. They ran along the east-west road and with a perfect field of fire overlooking an open area to their front in the direction that the Germans would be coming from.
You know, it was in December, right, just before Christmas, that we moved up into there. A foot of snow on the ground, and it's freezing our ass off. And then, you know, we're out in the foxhole in that kind of weather conditions. By that time, I was the company commander of E Company. So our battalion commander, Ben Vandervoort, had me take my company across this little river, and Alternative, I think it was called, and up on this ridge.
Also, they had one of the 57mm anti-tank guns sighted just further down this road behind the platoon's positions, so that in the event of German armour coming down the road, they would be able to fire directly at it. A second one was also sighted just around the bend. If German armour penetrated through the positions of E Company, it would at least be able to get off a couple of flank shots into anything that came around the corner. Other precautions taken by Meadow and the men of Easy Company here on the bluffs was to place AT mines across the road and then sight 6 bazooka teams on the left-hand side of the wood, ready to put in an ambush if any German armour did roll forward. And so by the late evening of the 20th into the early hours of the 21st of December 1944, Meadow and the men of Easy Company were now dug in these woods, just waiting for the German attack to begin. So the men of Easy Company didn't have long to wait for the Germans. At 0300, a German armoured car travelling down this road from the direction of Stavelot towards Trois Ponts was engaged and destroyed by the bazooka teams. Then, thinking on their feet, they grabbed the anti-tank mines, moved them to the other side of that armoured vehicle, and then a second German armoured vehicle coming again from the same direction struck the mines and was also destroyed. So as dawn broke, the Germans put in a probing attack into the Easy Company positions here along this road. Now, Easy Company were able to repulse the attack, and at that point, First Lieutenant Dorfler, the battalion G2, the intelligence officer, identified the dead German soldiers as being that of the 1st SS Panzer Division. So by mid-morning of the 21st, the second German attack of the day would commence, and this was a much larger one than the first. And despite the hard close-in fighting, the men of the 505th were able to hold their ground. Then the Germans started to employ their panzers and flak guns against the E Company positions. This heavy firepower was beyond the capabilities of the paratroopers, but Meadow had been ordered to stay on the bluffs until ordered off, and General Swift was adamant that the men remain in their positions. So at this point, Vandervoort knew the situation up on the bluffs here was a desperate one, and as such he ordered F Company, who were defending the town, up onto the bluffs here in order to try and provide some support on the flank of E Company against the German armour. Now, one advantage the paratroopers did have was that of First Lieutenant Cooper from the 81mm mortar platoon being up here with E Company, being able to direct the fire from the mortar battery on the northern hill down onto the Germans. So throughout the battle here on the bluffs, E Company never once fell back from their positions. Despite the weight of German fire, they'd been ordered to stay, was exactly what they were going to do. However, General Swift fortunately saw reason, and as the battle was reaching its pitch here, he then ordered E Company and F Company back down off the bluffs and back into the town of Trois Ponts. Now at this moment, Vandervoort grabbed his jeep, took off and came racing up here to the E Company positions. As Vandervoort was doing so, this was just at the same time as the German panzers were starting to get close to the E Company foxholes here in this patch of woods. As 4 or more panzers started to shell the foxholes relentlessly, Vandervoort found Meadow and gave him the order to bring his men off the bluff and back into the town.
That was probably the worst part of my combat experience. We had a hell of a time there, and finally had to withdraw. We just couldn't hold the Germans back. They outnumbered us by far, but we held them back long enough to make things more stable, if you will. And we were able to pull back across this little river. It wasn't organized. It was you're on your own. Get your ass out of here.
Also at that moment, Vandervoort grabbed the battalion XO who had made his way up here to the bluffs during the battle. So Vandervoort and Captain T.G. Swift would then race back down into the village in Vandervoort's jeep. Now, as the men of E Company withdrew, it wasn't a simple rout, it was a fighting withdrawal. Now normally that would mean one fire team would move back, baseline, then start putting fire onto the enemy positions, while the other teams would then start to move back under that covering fire. However, due to the weight of the German fire, it was slightly more disorganised than that. However, the paratroopers did take quite a heavy toll on the Germans as they advanced into their positions here. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of World War II Wayfinder, looking at the courageous defence of the town of Trois Ponts here between the 18th and 21st of December 1944 by the engineers and paratroopers of the US Army. If you have, please don't forget to hit that like button, and if you haven't already done so, consider subscribing to the channel. Okay, see you all in the next one.